I saw the trash can before I saw my name, and for a moment, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong wedding. It was silver, one of those tall reception bins with a plastic liner folded neatly over the rim, placed exactly where my chair should have been at table 6, right between the bride's parents and the groom's family, where a mother belongs on her son's wedding day. I stood there holding my clutch, my fingers tightening around the small satin fabric as the music swelled from the string quartet across the garden, and I waited for someone, anyone, to notice the mistake. No one did. A few guests glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away, their lips twitching in that way people do when they're not sure if they're allowed to laugh. Then I saw it. My name card. Not on the table. Not even misplaced. It was taped carefully, deliberately, to the side of the trash can. Margaret Whitmore, mother of the groom. I read it twice, just to be sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The late afternoon sun hit the gold lettering, making it shimmer in a way that felt almost mocking. Behind me, I heard a soft laugh. Then another. I turned slightly and caught a glimpse of Ashley, my daughter-in-law, standing near the champagne tower in her perfect ivory dress, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. She leaned in and said something to him, her lips curving into that polished, effortless smile she wore so well. He didn't laugh out loud. He just nodded. That was worse. I took a slow breath, the kind you take when you realize something inside you is about to shift permanently. The garden was beautiful. White roses lined the aisle. Crystal glasses caught the sunlight and scattered it across the tables. Everything looked exactly the way I had imagined when I helped plan this wedding, every detail I had paid for, coordinated, approved. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table just 3 months ago, reviewing catering invoices, adjusting floral budgets, making sure Daniel and Ashley could have the day they wanted without worrying about the cost. I remembered thinking, this is what family is for. This is what a mother does. I stepped closer to the table, my heels sinking slightly into the soft grass, and I reached out as if I might move the trash. Can aside, as if this were all some kind of misunderstanding that could be quietly corrected. Before my fingers even touched it, Ashley's voice floated over, light and airy. "Oh, Margaret," she said, drawing out my name just enough to make it feel like a performance. "You found your seat." I turned to face her fully now. Up close, her makeup was flawless, her expression open and pleasant, the picture of a gracious bride. If someone had taken a photograph in that moment, they would have seen nothing but warmth. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled. "I have always believed that dignity is not something you lose unless you hand it over." Ashley tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words, then gave a small, dismissive laugh. "Oh, it's just a joke," she said. "Don't be so dramatic." There it was. Simple. Clean. Effortless. The kind of sentence that erases responsibility and transfers it neatly onto the person being hurt. I looked at Daniel then. My son. The boy I had raised, the one who used to reach for my hand in crowded places, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. He avoided my eyes at first, adjusting his cufflinks, then finally glanced up with a tight, uncomfortable smile. "It's just for fun, Mom," he added. "Relax. Relax." I let that word settle between us, heavy and out of place, like it didn't belong in the same world as what I was looking at. For a second, just a second, I felt something sharp rise in my chest, anger, humiliation, disbelief, all tangled together. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled. Not wide. Not warm. Just enough. "Of course," I said softly. I lowered my hand, smoothing the front of my navy dress, the one Daniel had once told me made me look elegant. Around us, the music continued. Guests lifted their glasses. Someone called for a toast. The wedding moved forward, flawless and untouched, as if nothing at all had happened. I remained standing there for another moment, looking at that trash can with my name on it, and I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. This wasn't a joke. Jokes end with laughter shared by everyone in the room. This ended with me standing alone, and them watching to see how much I would tolerate. I picked up my clutch, straightened my shoulders, and took a quiet step back from the table. I didn't argue. I didn't ask them to fix it. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the garden, I understood exactly what role they had given me in this family. And more importantly, I understood that they had no idea who they had just decided to humiliate. I did not sit down for the ceremony. There was no place for me to sit, and somehow that felt more honest than forcing myself into a space that had already been taken away. I moved to the edge of the garden instead, near a row of white folding chairs reserved for distant relatives and acquaintances, people who had no real role in the story of this day. From there, I watched everything unfold with a kind of stillness I had never known before. The music shifted, soft and deliberate, signaling the start of the procession. Guests turned their heads in unison, smiles spreading across their faces as if this were the most natural, beautiful moment in the world. And maybe for them, it was. Ashley walked down the aisle with perfect timing, her father at her side, her dress catching the light in a way that made it seem almost weightless. She looked radiant, untouchable. Daniel stood at the altar, straight-backed, composed, his expression carefully arranged into something that resembled happiness. I studied his face, searching for something familiar, something that belonged to me. I found very little. When the officiant began to speak, his voice carried easily across the garden, warm and confident, filled with words about love, commitment, and family. Family. The word lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I folded my hands in front of me, feeling the slight tremor in my fingers before I stilled them. I had spent decades believing that family was something you built slowly, carefully, with patience and sacrifice. Something that grew stronger over time. But standing there, just a few yards away from my own son's wedding, I realized how quietly it could be redefined without you. A light breeze moved through the garden, lifting the edges of the tablecloths, brushing against my skin. It carried with it the faint scent of roses and champagne, a combination that should have felt celebratory. Instead, it felt distant, like a memory I was no longer part of. I watched as Ashley reached for Daniel's hands, their fingers intertwining with ease, as if they had always belonged that way. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just certainty that excluded everything else. When the vows began, the guests leaned in slightly, drawn by the intimacy of the moment. I remained where I was, neither leaning in nor stepping away. I simply observed. Ashley spoke first, her voice steady, her words carefully chosen, each one designed to sound sincere, heartfelt, permanent. She spoke about building a future, about trust, about standing together through anything. Daniel followed, repeating promises that sounded familiar in their structure, but unfamiliar in their meaning. I remembered a time when he used to promise me small things, things that mattered in ways no one else could see. That he would call when he got home. That he would visit on Sundays. That he would never let anyone come between us. Promises, I realized, are only as strong as the people who choose to remember them. A quiet murmur of approval moved through the crowd as they exchanged rings. Applause followed, polite at first, then building into something louder, more enthusiastic. People stood. Glasses were raised. Cameras flashed. It was everything a wedding should be. Perfect. Seamless. Complete. I did not clap. Not because I wanted to make a statement, but because the moment did not belong to me anymore, and I was no longer interested in pretending that it did. Instead, I turned my attention to the small details that others overlooked. The way Ashley's mother adjusted her necklace every few minutes, as if reassuring herself that everything was exactly as it should be. The way Daniel avoided looking in my direction entirely, even when his gaze swept across the crowd. The way a few guests whispered to each other, glancing briefly at me before quickly looking away. They had seen it. Of course they had. People always see more than they admit. They just choose what to acknowledge. The ceremony ended with a kiss, met with cheers and laughter, the kind that fills a space completely and leaves no room for anything else. Music rose again, brighter now, more celebratory. The officiant invited everyone to move toward the reception area, where dinner and speeches would follow. I remained where I was for a few seconds longer, letting the crowd begin to shift around me, letting the energy of the moment pass without pulling me with it. Then I took a slow breath and stepped forward, not toward table 6, not toward the place where my name had been turned into something disposable, but toward the edges of the celebration, where I could see everything clearly without being seen in return. And as I walked, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not sadness, but something quieter, more precise. Clarity. The kind that does not demand immediate action, but waits, observes, and remembers. The reception began exactly the way I had helped design it, as if the plans I had once carefully drafted were now being executed for someone else's life. Round tables dressed in white linen stretched across the lawn, each centerpiece arranged with the same precision I remembered approving weeks ago. Candle holders, polished to a soft glow, waited for dusk. Place settings were aligned perfectly, each fork and glass positioned with intention. It was all familiar. And yet, none of it felt like mine anymore. I walked slowly along the edge of the space, my heels clicking softly against the wooden platform that had been built for the evening, blending just enough with the background that no one felt the need to stop me or ask where I was going. That, I realized, was the new role I had been given. Not guest. Not family. Just presence. Something that could be acknowledged or ignored depending on convenience. I paused near the seating chart, a large decorative board framed in gold, where guests gathered briefly before finding their assigned tables. My name was still there, written in elegant script beneath table 6, as if nothing had changed. As if the truth of what had happened could be erased simply by maintaining appearances. I studied the list for a moment longer than necessary, tracing the names around mine. The bride's parents. Close friends. Important connections. And me. It looked right. It looked respectable. It looked like I belonged. I almost smiled at the contradiction. A young couple stepped up beside me, glancing at the chart, whispering quietly to each other. I caught a fragment of their conversation, just enough to understand the tone. "Did you see?" one of them began, before the other nudged him gently, a silent warning. To stop. They moved away quickly after that, their expressions carefully neutral. People always adjust their behavior around discomfort. They do not confront it. They step around it, pretend it is not there, and hope it fades on its own. I turned away from the chart and continued walking, letting the low hum of conversation build around me as guests settled into their seats. Laughter rose in small bursts, glasses clinked, chairs scraped softly against the floor. The atmosphere shifted from ceremony to celebration, from formality to ease. I noticed how easily everyone adapted, how quickly the moment of vows transformed into something lighter, something easier to enjoy. It was almost impressive. I stopped near the bar, where a bartender was pouring champagne with practiced efficiency, his movements smooth and repetitive. He looked up briefly when I approached, offering a polite smile that did not linger long enough to invite conversation. "Champagne?" he asked. I nodded once. "Thank you." The glass was cool in my hand, the bubbles rising steadily to the surface, catching the light in tiny flashes. I held it without drinking for a moment, watching the way the liquid moved, contained yet restless. It reminded me of something I could not quite name at first. Then I understood. It was the feeling I had been holding in since I saw that trash can. Controlled. Pressurized. Waiting. I took a small sip, just enough to taste it, then lowered the glass again. Across the lawn, I could see Daniel and Ashley moving from table to table, greeting guests, accepting congratulations, smiling for photographs. They moved as a unit, synchronized, effortless. When they reached table 6, Ashley paused briefly, glancing at the arrangement, then said something to one of the guests seated there. A ripple of laughter followed. Light. Casual. The kind that does not ask questions. Daniel laughed too this time. Not loudly, but enough. I watched that moment longer than I should have, committing it to memory with a clarity that surprised me. Not because it hurt. That part had already settled into something quieter. But because it confirmed what I needed to know. This was not an accident. It was not a miscommunication. It was a choice. Deliberate. Measured. And shared. I turned my gaze away from them and looked instead at the details that remained unchanged. The floral arrangements. The soft lighting beginning to glow. As the sun dipped lower. The band setting up near the dance floor, testing microphones, adjusting instruments. Everything was in place. Everything was ready for the evening to continue exactly as planned. I took another slow breath, feeling the air cool slightly as the day moved toward night. And in that shift, something inside me settled even further. Not resignation. Not acceptance. Something else. Understanding. I had spent years believing that my role in this family was permanent, that it was built on something unshakable. But roles can be rewritten. Quietly. Without discussion. Without warning. And once they are, the only question that remains is whether you continue to play along. I lifted my glass one last time, taking a measured sip, then set it down on the nearest table without looking back. Around me, the music began to swell again, signaling the start of the next part of the evening. Speeches would come soon. Toasts. Words about love and gratitude and family. I wondered, briefly, if anyone would mention me. Then I let the thought go. It no longer mattered. Because as I stood there, just outside the center of it all, I realized something with absolute certainty. They believed they had already defined my place in this story. What they did not realize was that I had just begun to redefine it myself. The speeches began just as the last light of the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the garden wrapped in a soft, golden glow from the string lights overhead. Guests settled into their chairs, their attention drawn toward the small raised platform near the dance floor where a microphone stood waiting. The sound of a fork gently tapping against a glass signaled the transition, and the low murmur of conversation faded into an expectant quiet. I remained where I had been standing, just beyond the main cluster of tables, positioned in that careful space where I could hear everything without being invited into it. Ashley's father was the first to speak. He walked up with an easy confidence, adjusting his jacket as he reached the microphone, his voice warm and practiced as he began. He spoke about love, about watching his daughter grow, about the pride he felt seeing her step into this new chapter of her life. His words were polished, filled with the kind of sentiment that draws nods and soft smiles from a crowd. People leaned in, attentive, engaged. Laughter followed at the appropriate moments, gentle and approving. It was exactly what a speech like that should be. I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my posture steady. There was a time when I would have been seated near the front, close enough to be seen, acknowledged, included in the rhythm of the evening. Now I observed from a distance, aware of how easily perspective can change depending on where you are placed. When he finished, applause followed, warm and sustained. Ashley rose briefly to embrace him, her expression glowing with gratitude, the image of a devoted daughter. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stepped forward with a slight hesitation, adjusting the microphone as if buying himself a moment. I watched him carefully, not searching for something anymore, but simply noticing. He cleared his throat, offered a small smile, and began. His voice was steady, though not as confident as the one before him. He spoke about meeting Ashley, about how she had changed his life, about the future they were building together. His words were simple, direct, designed to be sincere. The crowd responded kindly, their attention fixed on him, willing him into the role he was trying to fill. I noticed the way he avoided looking toward the edges of the gathering, keeping his gaze focused on the center, on the people who reflected back what he needed to see. It was a subtle choice, but not an accidental one. When he finished, there was another round of applause, louder this time, fueled by the collective energy of the moment. Ashley joined him, their hands finding each other again, their connection reaffirmed in front of everyone who mattered. Then came the pause, the brief transition where someone usually announces the next speaker, where attention shifts and anticipation builds again. I recognized that moment instantly. It was the space where I should have been called forward. The mother of the groom. The person who had raised him, who had stood beside him long before any of this existed. For a fraction of a second, the possibility lingered in the air, faint but present. Then it passed. The coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard tucked neatly against her side, stepped forward instead, her smile bright and efficient. "Thank you both for those beautiful words," she said into the microphone. We're going to move right into dinner service. Smooth. Seamless. No hesitation. No acknowledgement of anything missing. The transition was so clean that most people would not have noticed there had ever been a space for something else. I felt a small shift inside me then, not sharp, not sudden, but definitive. It was the confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. This was not oversight. It was design. Every detail of this day had been carefully arranged, every role assigned, every voice chosen or excluded with intention. And I had been quietly removed from the narrative long before I ever arrived. Around me, chairs moved as servers began to bring out plates, the rhythm of the evening continuing without pause. Conversations resumed, lighter now, focused on food, on music, on the simple pleasure of being part of a celebration. I watched as plates were set down at each table, as glasses were refilled, as laughter returned in easy waves. At table 6, the space where my name had once suggested belonging, the guests settled comfortably, their attention already shifting away from the earlier moment, if they had even registered it at all. The trash can was gone now, removed with the same quiet efficiency that had placed it there. In its place was an empty chair, neatly tucked in, indistinguishable from the others. As if nothing unusual had ever existed. I almost admired the precision of it. The ability to erase something so deliberate so completely, leaving behind no trace except in the memory of the person it was meant to affect. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, feeling the cool evening air settle around me. The music softened again, transitioning into something slower, more ambient, designed to fill the spaces between conversation without drawing attention. It was a careful balance, one that required planning, intention, control. All the things I understood very well. I glanced once more toward Daniel and Ashley, now seated together, their heads inclined toward each other as they spoke quietly, their expressions relaxed, satisfied. They looked exactly like a couple whose day had unfolded perfectly. And perhaps, for them, it had. I turned away from them without hesitation, my gaze moving instead toward the far edge of the garden where the lights were dimmer, where the details were less polished, where things were allowed to exist. Without being curated. And as I stood there, just outside the carefully constructed center of it all, I realized something with a calm certainty that settled deep and steady. They had not simply excluded me from a moment. They had revealed the truth of the entire structure I had been standing in for years. And now that I could see it clearly, I understood that what came next would not require noise or confrontation. It would require patience. And I had always been very good at waiting. The first person who approached me did not come from the center of the celebration, but from the quieter edge where I had chosen to stand. I noticed him before he spoke, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself with a kind of deliberate calm that did not belong to the noise of the evening. He was older, perhaps in his early 70s, dressed in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, his posture straight, his movements unhurried. When he stopped a few feet away from me, he did not immediately speak. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be explained. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "I was wondering when I would see you." I turned to face him fully, recognizing him after a brief moment. "Thomas," I replied. Thomas Green had been my late husband's attorney for years, a man who had handled every detail of our estate with a level of precision I had always trusted. He had attended family gatherings in the past, though never as a central figure. He was someone who observed more than he spoke. "I did not expect you to be here," I added. He allowed a faint smile to appear, subtle and controlled. "Your husband believed in being thorough," he said. "Even in matters like this." His eyes shifted briefly toward the main tables, where laughter continued to ripple through the guests, then back to me. "I also believe in paying attention." There was no need to ask what he meant. People like Thomas did not deal in vague statements. Every word carried weight. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. "It has been an eventful evening," I said, choosing my words with care. He inclined his head once more, as if that was enough confirmation. "I noticed," he replied. Simply. There was a brief pause between us, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if both of us understood that what would be said next required a certain level of clarity. Around us, the music shifted again, softer now, blending into the background as dinner continued. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter all formed a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the stillness of our exchange. Your husband made several decisions before he passed, Thomas continued, his voice measured. Decisions he believed would protect you. I felt something tighten slightly in my chest at the mention of him, but I did not let it show. I had learned, over time, that emotion does not need to be displayed to be real. He always believed in preparation, I said quietly. Thomas studied me for a moment, as if assessing not my words, but my understanding. Yes, he said. He did. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, not hurriedly, but with the kind of precision that suggested everything had been planned well in advance. From it, he withdrew a slim envelope, cream-colored, sealed. He did not hand it to me immediately. Instead, he held it between us, allowing the moment to settle. He instructed me to give you this only if I believed it was necessary, he said. His eyes did not waver. Tonight, I believe it is. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. And what does it contain? I asked. Clarity, he replied. And options. The simplicity of his answer was almost understated, but I understood enough to know that whatever was inside that envelope had been intended for a moment exactly like this. A moment when appearances no longer aligned with reality. A moment when decisions needed to be made without hesitation. I reached out and took it from him, feeling the weight of it in my hand. It was not heavy, but it carried something far more significant than paper. Thank you, I said, my voice steady. Thomas nodded once, as if the exchange had been completed exactly as it should have been. You will want to read it carefully, he added. And you will want to act with the same patience you have always shown. I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips, not out of politeness, but because I recognized the truth in his words. Patience has never been my weakness, I said. No, he agreed. It has not. For a moment longer, we stood there in silence, the sounds of the celebration continuing around us as if nothing of importance had just occurred. Then he inclined his head once more, a quiet gesture of respect, and stepped away, disappearing back into the flow of guests without drawing attention. I remained where I was, the envelope now resting securely in my hand, its presence both grounding and clarifying. I did not open it immediately. There was no urgency in my movements, no need to react in a way that would reveal what I had just been given. Instead, I turned slightly, positioning myself so that I could still see the center of the reception, where Daniel and Ashley continued to move through the evening, as if everything was exactly as they had intended. I watched them for a moment, taking in the ease of their expressions, the confidence in their posture, the quiet assumption that nothing stood beyond their control. Then I looked down at the envelope once more, running my fingers lightly along its edge, feeling the smooth surface beneath my touch. And in that moment, standing just outside the light of the celebration, I understood something with absolute certainty. They had spent the entire evening deciding what I was worth. Now, for the first time, I had been given the means to decide what they were. I did not open the envelope right away. Instead, I slipped it carefully into my clutch, the same way I had done with countless important documents over the years, always with intention, never with haste. Timing, I had learned, was everything. Around me, the reception continued to unfold exactly as planned, as if the entire evening had been rehearsed down to the smallest detail. Plates were cleared with quiet efficiency, replaced by new courses that arrived steaming and artfully arranged. The band began to play something softer, more rhythmic now, inviting the first few couples onto the dance floor. Laughter grew warmer, less restrained, as wine loosened conversation and the formality of the ceremony faded into something more casual. It was the part of the evening where people stopped paying attention to structure and started enjoying themselves, which meant it was also the part where no one would notice what did not belong. I remained at the edge, observing, allowing the rhythm of the night to carry on without me. Every movement, every glance, every interaction became clearer the longer I watched. It was as if distance had sharpened my vision rather than blurred it. I saw the way Ashley's friends clustered around her, their attention fixed on her like she was the center of gravity. I saw the way Daniel moved between conversations, his laughter slightly delayed, his gestures just a bit too measured, as if he were performing a role he had practiced, but not fully inhabited. And I saw the way no one looked toward the spaces where I stood. Not out of cruelty, not entirely, but out of convenience. It is easier to ignore what disrupts a perfect picture than to acknowledge it. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, offering one with a polite nod. I declined with a small shake of my head. I needed clarity more than comfort. My hand rested lightly against my clutch, feeling the presence of the envelope inside. It was still there. Solid. Real. Not something that could be dismissed or laughed away. I let my fingers linger for a moment, then withdrew my hand again. There would be a time to open it. Just not here. Not yet. The music shifted again, growing more upbeat, signaling the beginning of the first dance. A gentle ripple moved through the crowd as guests turned their attention toward the center of the dance floor. Daniel and Ashley stepped forward together, their movements synchronized, their expressions softening into something that resembled intimacy. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing attention on them alone, creating the illusion that the rest of the world had faded away. I watched as he placed his hand at her waist, as she rested hers on his shoulder, their bodies moving in slow, practiced steps. It was beautiful. It was convincing. And it was completely separate from anything that involved me. I felt no pull toward it, no desire to step closer or be included. That absence, more than anything, told me how much had already changed. The song continued, gentle and steady, drawing quiet smiles from the guests who watched. Some held hands. Some leaned into each other. It was a shared moment, one designed to connect everyone present through something simple and universal. But connection, I realized, is not created by proximity. It is created by intention. And intention had been made very clear tonight. As the dance neared its end, applause began to build again, soft at first, then stronger, filling the space with approval. The lights brightened slightly, and the illusion dissolved, returning the evening to its broader rhythm. More couples joined the floor. Conversations resumed. The night moved forward. I shifted my position slightly, stepping further into the shadows where the lights did not reach as strongly. From there, the entire scene unfolded in front of me like something I was no longer a part of, but still fully capable of understanding. I reached into my clutch again, this time more deliberately, my fingers closing around the envelope. I did not take it out. I did not break the seal. But I held it firmly, grounding myself in its presence. It was not anger that guided me now. Not even hurt. Those emotions had already done their work, sharp and immediate, clearing the way for something far more useful. Precision. I lifted my gaze once more, letting it rest briefly on Daniel and Ashley as they moved through the crowd, their confidence unshaken, their assumption of control intact. They believed the evening belonged to them entirely. That every outcome had already been decided. That every role had been assigned. I allowed a faint smile to form, subtle enough that no one would notice, but real enough that I could feel it settle into place. Because what they did not understand, what they could not see from where they stood, was that the evening had not ended when they thought it did. It had only just begun. And for the first time since I arrived, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was considering what I would do next. The moment I finally chose to open the envelope did not come with any announcement or shift in the room. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, like everything that truly matters. I stepped a little further away from the reception, past the soft glow of the string lights, toward a narrow pathway lined with low hedges where the sound of music softened into a distant echo. From there, the laughter and movement of the evening felt far enough away that it no longer pressed against me. I paused beneath a small lantern fixed to a wooden post, its light steady and warm, and only then did I take the envelope out of my clutch. For a brief second, I held it without opening it, feeling the smooth edge beneath my fingertips, aware that whatever was inside had been waiting longer than this moment had existed. Then, with a calm I did not have to force, I broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, formal, the kind used for documents that are meant to last. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes moving across the first lines, adjusting not to the language itself, but to the weight behind it. Legal terms, precise and deliberate, arranged in a structure that left little room for interpretation. I had seen documents like this before. I had signed them, reviewed them, trusted them. But never like this. Not as something that would shift the ground beneath everything I had assumed was stable. I read each line carefully, not rushing, allowing the meaning to settle fully before moving on. The trust, the assets, the conditions. My husband had not simply prepared for the future. He had anticipated the possibility that the future might not unfold with the kind of loyalty we had once believed in. And he had made sure that if that happened, I would not be left without control. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me in a measured release that carried none of the panic or shock someone might expect. Instead, it carried clarity. Because now, for the first time that evening, everything aligned. The distance, the dismissal, the calculated removal. It all made sense in a way it had not before. They had not just been pushing me aside. They had been positioning themselves, assuming that what mattered would eventually belong to them without question, without resistance, without consequence. I lowered the paper slightly, my gaze drifting toward the reception in the distance. From where I stood, the scene looked almost like a painting. Soft lights, moving figures, the suggestion of joy without the details that revealed its construction. Daniel and Ashley were near the center, surrounded by people who reflected their version of the evening back to them, reinforcing the idea that everything was exactly as it should be. They had no reason to think otherwise. I looked back down at the document, my fingers steady as I turned the page. The final section was shorter, but no less significant. Conditions tied to behavior, to respect, to public actions that reflected directly on the integrity of the family. It was written in language that did not accuse, did not assume, but simply defined. And within those definitions was a line that stood out with a quiet precision. Any individual who engaged in actions that publicly humiliated or intentionally diminished my position within the family would forfeit their claim to any future distribution of assets. I read that sentence twice, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to be certain I had not missed anything. The wording was exact. There was no ambiguity, no space for interpretation that could soften its meaning. I folded the paper carefully, returning it to the envelope with the same level of control I had used when opening it. There was no sudden movement, no dramatic shift in posture. Just a quiet completion of something that had already begun long before tonight. For a moment, I stood there in stillness, the envelope once again resting in my hand, the weight of it now fully understood. Then I placed it back into my clutch, securing it as if it had always belonged there. When I lifted my head again, my expression had not changed in any way that anyone would notice. But something deeper had settled into place. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something more precise than either of those. Decision. I took a step forward, then another, moving back toward the reception with the same measured pace I had maintained all evening. The music grew clearer again, the voices more distinct, the light stronger as I re-entered the space that had once felt distant. Nothing had changed in the way the evening looked. Everything had changed in the way I saw it. As I approached the edge of the gathering, I caught sight of Daniel once more, his back turned slightly as he spoke to a group of guests, his posture relaxed, his confidence intact. Ashley stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile effortless, her presence commanding. They looked exactly like two people who believed they were at the center of something permanent. I allowed my gaze to rest on them for a brief moment longer, not with resentment, not with longing, but with a clarity that required no emotion to sustain it. Then, I shifted my attention away, letting my eyes move across the room, taking in every detail, every interaction, every assumption that had been made without my knowledge. Because now, for the first time, I understood the full shape of what had been done. And more importantly, I understood exactly what it would cost them. I did not rush back into the center of the celebration. I let my return be as quiet as my departure, blending into the movement of the evening in a way that made me almost invisible again. But this time, it was a choice. The difference between being overlooked and choosing not to be seen is subtle, but it changes everything. The music had shifted into something livelier now, a rhythm that pulled more guests onto the dance floor, filling the space with motion and laughter. Conversations grew louder, less guarded, as the night deepened and the formality of the occasion gave way to something looser, more revealing. It was the perfect environment for truth to exist unnoticed. I moved slowly along the perimeter, my eyes taking in the details with a precision that felt almost instinctive now. The way people leaned closer when they spoke, the way expressions softened or sharpened depending on who was listening, the way certain glances carried more meaning than the words that followed. It was all there if you knew how to look. I stopped near one of the tables that had been partially cleared, the remnants of dinner still visible in half-empty glasses and folded napkins. A server passed by, collecting plates with efficient, practiced movements, never lingering long enough to become part of the scene. I reached for a glass of water this time, lifting it with steady fingers, taking a small sip as I allowed myself to settle into the rhythm of observation once more. Across the floor, Daniel was laughing again, this time more freely, surrounded by a group of friends who seemed eager to reinforce the version of the evening he wanted to believe in. Ashley stood nearby, her attention divided between him and the guests who approached her, her smile unwavering, her posture effortless. She moved through the space like someone who had already secured her position, who no longer needed to prove anything. I watched her for a moment longer than necessary, not with resentment, but with understanding. She had not created this situation alone. She had simply recognized an opportunity and shaped it to her advantage. That required a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of calculation. I recognized it because I had spent years using it for very different reasons. My gaze shifted then, moving past them, past the center of the room, toward the smaller interactions happening at the edges. A pair of older guests speaking in hushed tones, their expressions thoughtful, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the main table. A young woman adjusting her dress while checking her reflection in the darkened surface of a nearby window, her smile fading the moment she thought no one was looking. A man standing alone near the bar, scrolling through his phone, disconnected from the celebration around him. Everyone, in their own way, revealed something when they believed they were not being watched. And tonight, I was watching everything. I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table in a way that felt almost habitual, a small act of control in a space where control had been quietly taken from me earlier. Or at least, that was what they believed. I reached into my clutch once more, not to retrieve the envelope, but to feel its presence, to remind myself that what I now held was not just information, but leverage. Real, tangible leverage that existed outside the performance unfolding around me. I did not need to use it immediately. In fact, using it too quickly would diminish its effect. Precision requires timing. And timing requires patience. The band shifted again, announcing a faster song, drawing more people into the center, creating a moment where attention would naturally concentrate away from the edges. It was the kind of moment where small actions could happen without notice, where decisions could be set into motion without interruption. I turned slightly, positioning myself so that I could see both the dance floor and the path leading toward the service area, where staff moved in and out with quiet efficiency. My eyes followed that path for a moment, noting the rhythm, the flow, the way things moved behind the scenes to maintain the illusion of effortlessness. There was always a structure beneath the surface. Always a system that kept everything running smoothly. And systems I knew could be adjusted. Not dramatically. Not all at once, but in ways that changed outcomes without drawing attention to the change itself. I allowed a faint smile to return, subtle and controlled, as the idea settled more clearly into place. This was not about confrontation. It was not about standing in the center of the room and demanding recognition or apology. That would be too simple, too temporary. What mattered was not how they treated me in a single moment, but what they assumed they could continue to take from me moving forward. That was where the real shift needed to happen. I took a step back, then another, moving further along the perimeter until I reached a point where the light dimmed slightly and the noise softened just enough to create a sense of separation. From there, I could still see everything, but I was no longer part of it in any visible way. And that was exactly where I needed to be. Because as the night continued, as the music grew louder and the laughter more careless, I understood that the most important decisions of the evening would not be made in the center of the celebration. They would be made quietly, deliberately, in the spaces no one thought to watch. And I had already begun. By the time the night began to slow, most people no longer noticed the details they would have questioned earlier. Shoes had been loosened. Jackets removed. Laughter came easier now, louder, less filtered. The dance floor was full, the music steady, the energy of the evening carrying itself forward without effort. It was exactly the kind of moment where everything felt complete, where people believed the story of the night had already been written. I stood at the edge of it all, exactly where I had been for most of the evening, but this time there was no sense of distance, no feeling of exclusion. Only perspective. I reached into my clutch once more, not to check the envelope, but to take out my phone. The screen lit up softly in my hand, the familiar interface grounding in its simplicity. I did not hesitate. I did not scroll. I did not reconsider. I opened my contacts and selected a name that had been there for years, one I had rarely needed to use directly, but always knew would answer when it mattered. The call connected quickly, the voice on the other end calm, professional, expecting. "This is Margaret Whitmore," I said, my tone even, measured. "I would like to proceed with the adjustment we discussed." There was no need to explain further. The silence on the other end lasted only a second before the response came, clear and certain. "Understood," the voice replied. "We will begin immediately." I ended the call without lingering, without adding anything unnecessary. The phone screen went dark again as I slipped it back into my clutch, the action as quiet and controlled as everything else I had done that evening. Around me, nothing changed. The music continued. The laughter rose and fell in waves. Daniel and Ashley remained at the center of it all, surrounded by people who reflected their version of the night back to them, reinforcing the illusion that everything was exactly as it should be. They had no idea that anything had shifted. That was the nature of real change. It does not announce itself. It does not interrupt. It simply begins. I took a slow breath, letting the air settle evenly in my chest, then exhaled just as calmly. There was no rush now. No urgency. The decision had been made. The process had already started. Everything else would follow in its own time. I stepped forward slightly, moving just enough to adjust my position, to bring myself into a clearer view of the center without stepping fully into it. From there, I watched Daniel as he laughed at something one of his friends said, his posture relaxed, his expression open, unguarded in a way I had not seen in a long time. He looked happy, certain, secure in a future he believed was already his. Ashley stood beside him, her hand resting lightly against his arm, her gaze moving confidently across the room as she acknowledged guests, accepted compliments, maintained the effortless control she had held all evening. She looked exactly like someone who had achieved what she intended. I allowed my gaze to rest on them for a moment longer, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a clarity that required no emotion to sustain it. Then I looked away, letting my attention drift back to the broader scene, the movement, the sound, the carefully constructed harmony of the evening. It was all still there, untouched, unchanged on the surface. And yet, beneath it, something had already begun to shift in a way they could not see, could not anticipate, could not stop. I turned slightly, my posture straight, my steps measured as I began to move away from the center once more, not out of avoidance, but because I no longer needed to remain there to understand what was happening. I had seen enough. More than enough. As I walked, the sounds of the reception softened behind me, blending into a distant rhythm that no longer required my attention. The path ahead was quiet, lined with the same soft lights that had guided me earlier, steady and unchanged. I followed it without hesitation, my pace even, my expression composed, my mind clear. Because the most important part of the evening had never been the ceremony, or the speeches, or the laughter that filled the air. It had been the moment they revealed who they believed I was. And now, as I stepped beyond the edges of the celebration, I understood exactly what they were about to learn in return. Not tonight. not in a way that would disrupt their perfect ending, but soon. And when it happened, it would not come with noise or spectacle. It would come quietly, precisely, in the same way everything that truly matters always does. By the time they realized what had changed, there would be nothing left for them to hold on to except the memory of the moment they decided I was disposable.